Deidre Montague, and welcome to the State of Black Women series, where we will explore different topics that have a major impact on Black women. This is the fourth episode of the series, where we will be discussing the role of Black women in academia with two special guests. Next up, I'll be in conversation with Boston University's Associate Professor of Sociology, African American, and Black Diaspora Studies, SAIDA GRUNDY. Then, I will speak with Northeastern professor and one of the founders of the Women of Color in the Academy Conference, Dr. NICOLE ALJOE. You won't want to miss these powerful conversations. Stay tuned.
From this chair, our presidents have presided over the ceremonial functions of this institution. Melissa Gilliam, I ask that you now be seated in this chair and take your rightful place in the succession of presidents.
That sound you just heard was from Dr. Melissa Gilliam's presidential inauguration as the new 11th president of Boston University. She represents hope and change to many as the first woman and first Black woman to lead the university since it was founded. Welcome back. I'm Deidre Montague, your host for the State of Black Women series. Today's episode will focus on Black women in academia. Our first guest is Boston University's Associate Professor of Sociology and African American and Black Diaspora Studies, SAIDA GRUNDY. Let's take a listen. Thank you, Professor. I would love to start by asking you about what, especially in predominantly white institutions, what is it like for a Black woman trying to climb the ladder in higher education? What's different about that circumstance in comparison to others or to white professors?
Well, it's so nuanced because it's kind of like being on a football team. It's like, well, what position do you play on that team? It's like Black quarterbacks are going to have a different type of discrimination than a Black wide receiver. And so like within a university, we experience different degrees, the constrictive nature of racism based on places where Black women are expected to be or not, right? So I think in all of higher ed, we are underrepresented, but in some areas, we just have a longer track history. So for example, in schools of education, you're probably going to find more Black women faculty, whereas in schools of engineering, you're not, right? So, and those disciplines are very different in terms of what they value, how you navigate them, and what's considered being a good scholar. So at an R1, at a Research 1 university, the expectation is research, right? That you will not only have to do research of a certain caliber, but depending on what field you're in, you might have to do a certain quantity of research or research that brings in a certain number or prestige in grants. That's different than being a Black woman at a smaller teaching college that might be more amenable to Black faculty or not, right? It could be that you're in a very white supremacist teaching college. But all that to say, what your task is, what the climb is very different across higher ed. In fact, that's one of the challenges in mentorship that I tell Black graduate students all the time is to get specific in your mentorship. I think part of being Black, and I've heard some people in other ethnicities say it's very similar. I've heard like my South Asian friends say it's very similar. This idea of there's an obligation to provide advice for everyone coming behind you, right? So I will get requests, oh, my daughter wants to go to nursing school. Can you talk to her? Because if you're an everyday Black person, all you're thinking is, my daughter wants to go to grad school, and I know someone who went to grad school, so you should talk to her. But in reality, there's nothing I can tell someone who's going to nursing school. That's not my field, right? Remotely. And so even when it comes to Black women faculty, part of the challenge we have, it is rare for us to get the kinds of specific mentorship from people who come ahead of us. In lucky instances, those might be Black women, but there's no guarantee if she's a Black woman that she's going to be pro-Black women. It's very rare for us to get that unicorn of someone who's actually been in our lane, done it ahead of us, and who has some regard for Black women's paths. So we kind of end up hodgepodging mentorship in ways that it's not ideal. It's not ideal versus a white guy in these fields probably has 5 or 6 white guys who have come ahead of him, who he's making a constellation of mentors, and therefore he can compare their advice. It's like you're getting a whole lot of data. That actually means you're getting better mentorship because it's like, oh, I have an aggregate of data to work here. I have a guy who has this resource, a guy who has this resource. So we're talking about network effects that are just smaller for Black women in academia.
One of the things that gained national attention with Black women in academia was Nicole Hannah-Jones and the tenure situation. Her not receiving tenure from her alma mater at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and ultimately choosing to teach at an HBCU, Howard University, after that incident. Can you just talk about the tenure process and how that can be for Black women trying to gain that and the importance of it?
So unlike medical licensing, unlike the bar, where for lawyers, the bar is their licensing, and that is a state organization. It's a statewide private organization, right? So you will have the Georgia Bar Association, which every lawyer who is licensed to practice in the state of Georgia has gone through that, right? Or for medical licensing, you'll have not only licensing by the state board, but you'll have licensing within your specialty. So anesthesiologist, that's a different level of licensing. So we don't have that equivalent. What we have is tenure, and tenure is an entirely intersubjective process. And what intersubjective means is the council of people in your department or in your college. So not college as in Spelman College, college as in the unit within a university. So if you're in a law school or a college of law, your tenure might be all the faculty at that law school vote on you, and you just have to get like a 2/3 majority. It's much more like Congress. If you're in a department, let's say you're in a department of 40 faculty members, it doesn't have to be unanimous to get tenure. It helps. It helps because tenure goes in rounds. You have to go all the way up. The department's just the first round. And so in my case, I come up for tenure in my department. My department votes on that. Let's say that there's no cause for alarm at the department level, that there's no critical mass of people who think that my case is not good. That goes on to the College of Arts and Sciences. They have a committee. They vote on it. Then that goes on to the university. Then the university's tenure committee votes on it, at which point it then goes to the provost, and then she has to vote it up or down. So we're talking about 4 rounds. Tenure's taken very seriously because it is the only thing we have in terms of academics that gives us the equivalent of job security. But it's also because it's intersubjective, meaning it's not objective. We deliberately don't make objective qualifications for tenure because you want to be able to interpret people's cases differently. So no, there are very few places where you will ever see that it says, well, tenure here means you have to have a book and 3 articles in this journal and 2 articles in that journal. It's based on, at the department level, it's based on what they feel has met the standard for research, service, and teaching. It really, really helps if the people voting on you are also people who are advocates of Black women and things like, for example, in the teaching process. We know from teaching evaluations matter in your tenure case. And students don't understand this, but everything they write at the end of the term gets aggregated into our files. And so the chair or the committee has to prepare a whole report about your teaching. And if there are bad reviews, students don't think about this, but if they're saying negative things about a teacher, that comes into your tenure conversation. It really helps, for example, if someone can interpret those differently. So we know that student evaluations are more highly correlated to the race and gender of the instructor than they are anything else. And overwhelmingly, the worst student evaluations go to women of color, particularly women with non-Western European foreign accents. So women with accents from the global South, women with East Asian accents, South Asian accents, South American accents. Those are the people who get the lowest ratings. Black women are among the lowest rated. But it takes someone understanding in the tenure discussion and the vote to say, actually, we should keep in mind that she's being penalized for being a black woman, right? Those are things that actually matter when black women are coming up for tenure. So there's the part of it that you control as the researcher. You control your productivity to an extent. That productivity is also can be based on social inequalities, but that's getting into the muck. But it really helps if people on the other side of that vote are arguing to consider the other factors of race and gender that are going into your case. Considering, for example, so the most prestigious journal in sociology, two journals, is the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review. They rarely publish the work of black women because the work of black women, one, tends to be focused on issues of race and gender, tends to be qualitative versus quantitative. So quantitative meaning statisticians. They like one of the ASR in particular, they like quantitative, they like stats. Well, in sociology, stats skews toward men. It's a gender thing. More male sociologists are quantitative sociologists. So if your department says, well, the thing we value is that you publish in these top two journals, you're probably not going to tenure a bunch of black women because those two journals don't publish many black women. They don't publish papers about research on black women. So the last article I read in AJS about black women was about black lesbian families, and that was a classic article because everyone was so surprised that an article on black lesbians got published in this top prestigious old white guy journal. So again, you have to have a department that says, oh, well, she does work in such and such, and this journal is far more progressive, so she chose to publish there. Or this journal is far more up and coming, she chose to publish there. So someone has to interpret your case. And if they're only interpreting it from a white male dominant lens, or even a white female dominant lens, because sociology is very white woman heavy, then they're probably not going to value what black women bring to the table as academics.
Thank you for that, Professor. Another big case that was national was Claudine Gay. Some people are saying she was pushed out of her position as president of Harvard University. Can you talk about some of the outrage around that, especially for black women professors? There were many people that came out online or wrote different articles exclaiming their frustration with this or their fears about this happening.
Yeah, I mean, so for President Gay, that was an all-out attack. That was an orchestrated attack. She was deliberately attacked. And a big thrust of that attack was that a lot of older white male alumni, sometimes young white male alumni, feel as though Harvard is their bastion. It's the bastion of extremely elite white men. And for them, you remember Larry Summers, who was a former president of Harvard. He was actually asked to step down because he said these offensive things about women in the sciences. He said something to the effect of like, well, women aren't good at science. He was an economist. He was asked to step down. He was replaced with Drew Faust, who is a white woman. Drew Faust is a historian. And so it was like white women got their moment at Harvard. There were many of that old guard who felt that they needed revenge for Larry Summers, that Larry Summers was a big deal. He was a Clinton appointee. I believe he was an Obama appointee at one point. very extremely well-known economist. There were those who felt like they should get revenge for that, their pound of flesh, because Larry Summers was a legitimate president and all these others were, particularly Claudine Gay was a diversity hire. They thought that she wasn't in that position because of her qualification, but just because she was a black woman. And they were very orchestrated and very, very vengeful at making sure that they got her out. This comes from 10 plus years ago. This didn't start this year or last year. She was a dean before she was president. They've been on the attack because Harvard doesn't just pop up and pick a president. They groom people to be president. So it was clear that she was in a line of succession before she was appointed.
Thank you, Professor. In doing research for this episode, there seems to be a need of higher education to be more supportive to Black women that are entering their spaces. Another case that was big was in Missouri at the HBCU Lincoln University with Antoinette Bailey. She was a former administrator there who died by suicide in May 2023. She reported experiencing months of harassment, bullying, and differential treatment from her white colleagues while working under the university's president, John Mosley, and his administrative leadership. This led to a big outrage about how Black women are being treated in higher education. Can you talk about how universities and colleges can better support Black women who are facing similar circumstances or just as a whole?
And not knowing all the details of what happened at Lincoln, from the outside, what it looks like, Lincoln is a historically Black college, important historically Black college, but certainly in the last few decades has been in financial straits. And Lincoln also has had some assets that were really valuable to white people, and they got harmed out of those assets. So, for example, there was an art collector in Philadelphia who had an art collection that was so valuable that it surpassed evaluation. Like, it was invaluable. Like, we're talking about originals of some of the finest artists in the world, we see in the likes of the Louvre, and he was a private collector. And he was an interesting, eclectic man in that he bestowed his entire collection to Lincoln. And we're talking, again, we're not talking about 100 million. We're not talking about 500 million. This is invaluable. We're talking about the type of collection, it would actually give Lincoln political power, right? Not just a new building or what have you. And as soon as his will was read, he didn't have any children. As soon as his will was read, there was immediately an effort in the Philadelphia art community, in the state legislature, and in I think it was the mayor's office, to say basically this Black college cannot have this collection. This collection is too valuable to be at this Black college. And of course, they were going to use it as their endowment. So now their endowment would be like $1 billion, right? But basically, it was very clear in this man's will that he left it to Lincoln, and they carved Lincoln out of it, and all of a sudden, all this art became the property of the state or a private entity. And then Lincoln, in exchange, got a new student center, something that's probably worth $5 million, if that, right? A building that's probably worth $5 to $10 million is what they got out of a deal that was probably worth $1 billion. All that to say, even at Black colleges, I don't think people should mistake Black colleges as places that aren't at the whims of white supremacy. Black colleges are often very vulnerable to things like private donors, state funding, federal funding. They're very vulnerable. And so in the situation at Lincoln, what I understand is that there was a white man became president who came from the sports side of things. He was the athletic director. And I don't know what happened in terms of leading to the tragedy. I do know she left a note. It's never simple in terms of, Black person equals pro-Black. Political interests are very nuanced in these institutions. Whatever led to her tragedy, it wasn't as simple as oh, well, there are other black women inside Lincoln and I can depend on them. There are many, many ways to destroy a black woman in higher ed.
How can colleges be more supportive to black women in these spaces? How can they provide more than just promises? How can they be more helpful to black women?
Asking them to work against who they are is pointless. Up until the 1980s, many of the Ivies weren't even gender co-ed, right? So it's like Columbia University wasn't co-ed up until 1980. Most of these Ivies have only served white male students for the majority of their existence, and we're talking about multiple centuries. Asking them to serve black women, that's not the point. The point is to reproduce class inequality and racial inequality. That's like asking the United States military to support. The United States military is a white, hegemonic, patriarchal machine. They're not going to do anything against that. The point of the military is global dominance in the interest of Western markets, Western politics, white male dominance, etc. So there's nothing these universities can do. I will say there is a quality that places have when they are a little more tolerable for black women, and that tends to be a critical mass of black faculty. You can't just hire one-offs. You can't just say, oh, well, chemistry has this one black professor. We know this from studies of corporations. If you don't have a critical mass, you're not doing anything to change the culture of that corporation. But with universities, they don't want critical masses because they still believe in black inferiority. So they don't want black women faculty because too many black women faculty means they're not a good university. There's no support universities can do. The best they can do is get out of our way on something, provide us the same resources, and allow us to do our own sort of maneuvering and own support, right? Basically, these are plantations in the most neoliberal sense, right? Not a plantation in terms of slave plantation. We are getting salaries, but plantations in terms of labor. And the idea of an institution that's going to extract labor from you for the lowest it can get it, somehow that being supportive, that's a Disney movie.
Since our humble beginnings in a small town in Vermont, Boston University has been a place for courage in the face of challenges, a place of openness in a society that was often closed, a place of optimism during times of hopelessness, and a place that has been open to an increasingly global world when many others could only see what was directly in front of them. To Boston University trustees, faculty, staff, students, alumni, and friends, now is our moment. Let us use our traditions of intellectual courage, academic rigor, service, openness, art, and creativity to drive our next transformation. It is our time to, together, build that research institution through integration, discourse, engagement, and impact. Let's look to our traditions for new ways to transform our great university once again. Thank you.
That sound you just heard was from Dr. Melissa Gilliam, the new president of Boston University, speaking at her 2024 presidential inauguration to the mass crowd of staff, faculty, students, alumni, and guests about how she plans to transform the campus under her new leadership with their help and support. Welcome back. I'm Deidre Montague, your host for the State of Black Women series. Today's episode will focus on Black women in academia. Our next guest is Dr. NICOLE ALJOE, a Northeastern professor and one of the founders of the Women of Color in the Academy Conference, which provides a safe space for women of color to get support and resources as they climb the career ladder of academia. Let's take a listen. Thank you so much, Dr. NICOLE, for this interview. For those that don't know, could you share a little bit about the amazing Women of Color program you do for women in the Academy?
Sure. So the Women of Color in the Academy initiative started in Our first conference was in 2016. Basically, I was inspired by the 1993 conference for Black women in the academy that Evelyn Hammond convened at Harvard. And that was just an amazing experience. And having the experience of being one of very few faculty members and a faculty woman of color in my departments over the years, it's just very isolating. And collaborations and community has consistently been really important to me. So the director of then our advanced office, which is an office for faculty development at Northeastern, and it was tied to a STEM grant that Northeastern had received, and to increase the numbers of faculty women of color in STEM, Northeastern decided to host that department permanently, or that program permanently on campus, and make it available to all faculty, basically. But I was really thinking that we needed something for ourselves, basically, and wanted to replicate this conference. And so myself, the director of Advanced at the time, Jan Reinhardt, and then a faculty member in the nursing school, Barbara Guthrie, we got together and approached the administration and asked if they would provide some funding for a conference. And we thought it would just be a one-off. And so we had that first conference in 2016. As I said, it was incredibly well attended, even though the conference was in February and there was a storm. And like a couple of people couldn't make it because of the storm and all kinds of things. But so many women showed up, and even with the snow, and it was just such a gratifying experience. And so we decided to do it again. So it turned into an annual conference that we've had, and it spawned a number of other smaller events. Before COVID, we had quarterly soirees where women would get together in the Boston area and just network, create community, and that kind of thing. But the focus was on, we know the numbers the numbers of women of color faculty are very small, and that their paths to advancement are often very complicated, and that there were concrete things that people had done studies, done research, all kinds of things. Some things specifically like the work that Stacey Blake Beard at Simmons has done, at Simmons and Dartmouth, around mentoring and the importance of mentoring, and the idea of shifting from the single kind of guru mode of mentoring that was most common among mainstream academics, but that doesn't really work for us if you're the only one, right? So moving closer towards this idea that you need a community, right? So a board of mentors as opposed to single. So yeah, so that's basically how it's come about. So the conference annually, we usually have a keynote speaker in some way, shape, or form, but we also importantly set time aside to focus on things like self-care as well, because that's really important. So there are workshops about the importance of taking rest, and the importance of making sure who's in your network and checking in with yourself. Things like that are super important.
You were talking about some of the struggles to advancement for women of color in the academy. Can you just talk about what are some of the things that have been coming up for those that have been coming to the conferences? What are they primarily voicing as women of color?
So it's a variety of issues. Some of it depends on institution, some of it depends on discipline and things like that. So, I mean, there's the issue of mentors. Very often some institutions assign people mentors without really thinking about, is this the best person for this individual to work with? So empowering women to know that even though your institution or your unit might have assigned you a particular individual, you don't have to always go to that individual, that you can reach out to alternative networks to get the kind of support that you need if you're not getting it in the place where you're supposed to get it. There's been issues of isolation, right, where very often women of color are the only people of color or women of color in their departments or their units. So thinking about ways to create community, reaching out to folks outside of your unit. One of the things that we do at Northeastern, which has been really wonderful, is we have lunches for women faculty of color, and we do that once officially, formally, once in the fall and then once in the spring. But folks get together and they connect informally over the course of the semester. We have a Slack channel where folks can post groups that folks can use to connect. So I think that the conference helps to facilitate those kinds of connections. I think the other thing is that there's a lot of higher education. There's the hidden curriculum, where if your parents or people already who are in academia, then you know where to go and who to ask. But if you don't, if you're the first in your family member to go to college, get an advanced degree, you're not going to know that. So it's important to share information and to find this information and to let people know that there are all kinds of fellowships available that people might not know about, helping people to think about how to ask for support to do writing retreats, things like that. We've also had a lot of interest from folks in STEM because they have a very different, I'm in the humanities, I'm in the English department and Africana Studies department program at Northeastern. And so that's a very different context. So I'm not working in a lab. I don't have to deal with those kinds of hierarchical relationships that very often define the ways that this folks in STEM operate and understand each other, understand themselves. We've been very intentional on focusing on that kind of work and how you can take care of yourself, basically, and make sure that you are moving forward and getting credit for the work that you do in particular labs, right, when you're the only one.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nicole. Another thing when doing research for this episode was specifically the tenure issue with Nikole Hannah-Jones. Can you speak a little bit to that for those of us who don't understand the process? I know a lot of us were outraged for her and happy for her when she was able to shift over to the HBCU, but can you talk a little bit about that process?
The tenuring issue is a major issue because that is an issue of job security, right, in terms of higher education. The idea is that you have, in most places, 6 years to prove yourself, do the right publications, teach the right kinds of classes, that kind of thing. And at the end of 6 years, you're evaluated by your colleagues and by the university as a whole as to whether they will keep you on, because once you have tenure, now they get around it in all kinds of ways. But usually the process is once you have tenure, you have job security, and that unless you are arrested or do something horrible, you don't lose your job. So that way you have the freedom to do your research and publish in ways that you want and contribute knowledge in these productive kinds of ways. So that the tenure process is one of the key ways in the academy where women of color their progress is halted in a variety of ways. Very often, because many women of color are the only people in their units, other people in a department or their unit might not understand what they do. And so then the onus, how it's supposed to work is that, yes, the faculty member needs to explain who they are and what the work they've done in their dossier. So this is the material that you bring together, documents the work that you've done over X number of years. So yes, that's supposed to tell a particular kind of story. But on the other hand, the unit is supposed to go to that and to read that in a semi-objective kind of way, or as objective as possible. And study after study has shown that's totally not the case, that usually women of color are held to incredibly high standards, right? We see it now with Vice President Kamala Harris running for president, and people are like, well, we don't really know what she does, and we don't really know who she is. We've had so many years to know who she is. We know who she is. She's shown us over and over again. And it's the same with women faculty of color, that their work is overlooked, their work is ignored in all kinds of ways. And so, right, the very real work that Nikole Hannah had done over her career, which is more than many faculty members have done over their career, and the idea that that's not somehow exemplary is just an example of gatekeeping. And so they want to not allow people to progress in the ways that they should. Nepotism, unfortunately, is a real thing where people, they've shown studies that units tend to try to replicate themselves. And so if you're in a unit where it's mostly folks of a particular criteria, a particular look, then more than likely, those are the people that are going to move forward. And people who don't look like that, if the unit has not invested in notions and ideas of inclusiveness and thinking about diversity and multicultural aesthetics and ideologies as being important to them, they're not going to value them. So when they're presented, they're just going to ignore them. But yeah, there are ways that the process of tenuring completely disadvantages women of color. The reliance on student evaluations, student class evaluations, for example, even though, again, study after study have shown that student evaluations are completely useless, that they're so incredibly subjective, that women of color are evaluated on and critiqued for the most ridiculous things. It got to the point in my career where I stopped looking at my student evaluations. Students were commenting on the clothes that I wore, my affect in the classroom, rather than focusing on the substance of the work that they were able to complete in the class and how I presented that work. So that kind of stuff is annoying, and it's demoralizing to think that some 18-year-old thinks that what I look like and what I dress like, that's going to be the foundation for somebody basically denying me my job and challenging me at my job. But yeah, the tenure process is definitely fraught. But I've been gratified that over the years, many institutions are moving to make the process more transparent. So making more of an effort to make sure that people have mentors or they have a committee of people that are helping them to go through the tenure process. There are all kinds of coaches available now that weren't available in the past. There's also a lot more networking involved. So people are talking on Twitter, or what was Twitter, X now, but there's a lot, on Black Twitter, people are talking about tenure cases and how best to organize your material, that kind of thing. So yeah, it really is a fraught process, but I'm hopeful that it is moving forward in a good direction, that there are, even at an institution like Northeastern, there's definitely many more faculty women of color that are tenured than when I arrived. When I arrived in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, I was one of a handful of women of color. Now that number is moving up into the double digits. So much, much, much better situation. And it's because people have been mindful, right? And know that, right? The tenure process is problematic. How can we prepare people effectively to go through the tenure process? Let's be as transparent as possible. Tell people, this is what you need to get tenure here in this unit, in this institution at this time, and make sure that their dossiers adhere to that.
Thank you so much for that. There seemed to be a rise at one time of many women of color, Black women ascending to these higher education roles, which was a super exciting time. And then we saw what some would consider a takedown of Dr. Claudine Gay. I would just love to hear your thoughts on that situation, and also what your advice would be for women of color, Black women who may feel fearful about entering into the academy after seeing that public issue come out.
Yeah, I mean, that was so demoralizing and so awful to watch that. So I think it's the amplification of this kind of concern that Black women are scary, and that we're not appropriate, and that leadership looks a particular kind of way. And again, we see that, right? We're saying that now, right? People complaining that we can't have Vice President Kamala Harris as president because she's a woman and she's Black, and nobody else looks like her. When we look at leaders around the world, even though that's not true, there have been Black leaders of countries all across the globe, Black female leaders across the globe. I think it's mostly myopia and fear in terms of trustees and in terms of the establishment. And I think the other issue in terms of alleviating the fear for women, for Black women or women of color, who want to aspire to these leadership positions, but are afraid to because of what happened to former President Claudine Gay. I think it's important to remember that support and very strong support networks are very key. And it was never clear to me that Claudine Gay had the support of her board of trustees or of senior faculty members at Harvard. And her case is particularly complicated further by that she was involved in the denial of tenure to Garcia Loria Pena. And so you had a woman of color, Claudine Gay, who was dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, Garcia Loria Pena, right? She was denied tenure while Gay was dean, and Gay didn't really seem to be very supportive of Pena's case. So that situation, it's a little complicated there. But I do think that even though there are these fears about being taken down by outside forces and all of that, that nevertheless, to quote Elizabeth Warren, right, we persist. So, I'm gratified that Melissa Gilliam is president of Boston University, Crystal Williams is president of RISD, Paul Johnson is still at Wellesley, and Wooten, I know her last name is Wooten, at Simmons. And then, of course, we've had the wonderful example years long of the former president of Brown. So I think that, yes, there are a couple of examples where Black women have been taken down, but I think there are more examples of cases where Black women as presidents were successful. And I think it's important to pay attention to those cases and those instances, and to look at the Claudine Gay incident as a particular instance that had its own particular context and its own particular history. But that I wouldn't say that Gay's example, that Gay is a cautionary tale for all women of color.
So thank you for that. I would love for you to speak on, for maybe people who are in the academy that are white. Can you just speak to the strengths and the unique skills that women of color bring to the academy that should be celebrated and should be welcomed?
Yes. So the college population is diversifying rapidly. Fewer and fewer students are white, middle, upper class. Many more students are going to be people of color. In order to relate to them, to have the students resonate with them, you have to have a faculty that reflects the diversity of the population. And that population includes women of color. So you can't have lily white faculty teaching, this incredibly diverse student population. Just doesn't work. The students feel isolated. They don't feel committed. They don't feel seen in the classroom. They feel isolated and they feel tokenized, even though they are the majority, right? The majority of the globe is actually people of color. It's not white folks. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. But I will say, I do want to acknowledge that there are, and I have had white colleagues, particularly white female colleagues, but also white male colleagues who've been incredibly supportive of me. And they've had my back, they've offered advice, they've helped me to do things, they've suggested my name in meetings. And that kind of work that allies can do is incredibly, incredibly important. And I'm definitely eternally grateful for the work that they have done on my behalf. And just to share one concrete example, I was in a meeting. I was the only woman of color faculty member, of course, in this meeting. And the person who was running the meeting turned to me and, of course, asked me the race questions like, oh, so, as a person of color, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? And that's always the question that we're asked, right? And I'm tired. I don't always want to be answering that question. And plus, I can't speak for all people of color. I have a particular experience. I can speak to that experience, but I can't speak generally for all people. But thankfully, before that meeting, a very good friend of mine was a full professor, white woman. She pulled me aside and she said, I know what's going to happen, and I know that you're going to get asked, the Black question. So how about, instead of you answering that question, because I know you're exhausted, you're on 5 million committees and you have everybody in your office asking for advice. How about if you kick that question to me when you're asked that question? And I was like, okay, I don't know what this is going to look like, but let's see. And so I was asked the question and I said, I think so-and-so has some really interesting commentary on that question. Let's have her contribute. And that was great. So I didn't have to say anything. She said the things that I would have said, and I didn't have to be, okay, I'm giving the Black response. And it was great. And it was like literally a load off my shoulder for that meeting. So at least for that meeting, I didn't have to carry the weight of every faculty member of color on my back for that meeting. And that was really wonderful labor that she did on my behalf. And I really appreciated it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nicole. My last question for you is, why is it important to have safe spaces like Women in the Academy, the conferences that you hold every year?
Yeah, because it's so stressful otherwise. It is emotionally hard to be. I am the only tenured Black female in the English department at Northeastern. I like my colleagues for the most part. They're very lovely people. They're supportive, but I am the only Black face at the table on a regular basis. And I mean, I know that I do good work. I'm recognized in all kinds of ways, but it's still very isolating. And so I need to see people who look like me. I need to be around people who understand me and who understand where I'm coming from, where I don't have to explain every single aspect of who I am and where I am and what I'm doing and all of that stuff. Not to say that that doesn't go on. That's certainly, I don't have the exact experience as every person of color, every woman of color, that kind of thing. So it's definitely a given. But there are ways that we can connect, and I can exhale, as Terry McMillan wrote. I can exhale in these contexts. I can feel comfortable. And also I can validate myself and know that I'm not crazy. I'm not overthinking. I'm not being too sensitive, that these things are real, that are happening, and that this space is incredibly, incredibly valuable to me for helping me to do the kind of work that I do, because it is labor. I have students in my office on a regular basis, students of color who are feeling isolated or having issues on campus, faculty members who are in my office. So there's all of this giving that I'm doing in terms of mentoring others and supporting others. And so I need support as well. I need to rest. And so having these safe places allows me to kind of, as Alice Walker says, tend to my garden, because and to take care of myself, right? Because I can't take care of others unless I'm good with who I am. And the conference, the lunches, all of these things that we do together, they're important for helping me to refill my tank.
I just had a follow-up question.
Sure,
I
sure.
promise it's my last one.
No, it's
Um,
okay.
it made me think about when you said the students sometimes give bad evaluations for women of color's hair or their affect or the way they dress. What
Mm-hmm.
would you recommend for students who may have a woman of color professor who is different than them, who is different in culture and hair and in mannerisms? What would your advice be for them to be mindful of as they write those evaluations?
So first of all, I don't think students realize that the evaluations are read in a professional capacity. So I think if they understood that the professor is being evaluated, that their job is at stake, I think if more students understood that, that's not just the professor reading the evaluations, it's the professor's supervisor, and then the entire unit is reading these evaluations. I think that would help students to understand that they should be more mindful in evaluating and writing their evaluations. Also, that we're human beings, and saying things like constantly commenting on my dress. And I once had a student say that she seems to spend more time picking out her clothes than planning her classes. And I'm like, I was up all night planning my class. Yes, I look fire, but I plan my clothes over the weekend. Every day I'm planning this class. I'd like acknowledgement of the labor. I don't think students understand the labor that goes into very often. I shouldn't blanket all students, but some students don't understand the labor. They think we just roll into class and it just comes out of our heads, not realizing that I'm up the night before. I'm planning. I have all the questions out. I'm thinking about the questions they're going to ask. I'm coming up with my own questions. I'm trying to find readings, thinking about pop culture connections. Like, I'm doing all of this stuff to teach. And I think acknowledgement of the professionalism and the amount of labor that goes into teaching, I think, would encourage students to be more mindful in their responses.
Absolutely. And it's just part of our culture to be fire dressers, and
Yes,
it's just part of who we are, especially I think as Black women. We love dressing.
exactly. It expresses who I am. And that just comes naturally to me. I'm not like thinking like, well, and all that stuff. It's like, pull things out. I buy things because they match, right? So I don't have to think about this.
Thank you, Dr. ALJOE. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Special thanks again to Professor SAIDA GRUNDY and Dr. NICOLE ALJOE. Tune in to our final episode of this series where we discuss the next generation, Black girls. I'm your host, Deidre Montague. Thanks for listening.